At 3:40 p.m. on Tuesday, May 27, 1997, the ground in Double Creek Estates begins to move. Not the houses, the ground. The tornado that has been tracked across central Texas for the past hour is sitting over this specific quarter mile of subdivided Texas blackland prairie, and it is sitting here slowly. The forward motion of the storm at this moment is estimated between 5 and 10 miles per hour, a pace approximately equal to a person walking with intent. A house that is 3 minutes ahead of the storm on its track will receive the full force of an F5 tornado in 3 minutes. A house that is at the center of the storm's path when the tornado arrives over it will receive the full force of an F5 tornado for 3 minutes. In tornado science, the difference between those two sentences is the difference between catastrophic damage and the most violent local destruction ever documented in the history of American weather. The first scenario, tornado approaching, brief intense winds, tornado moving on, describes every violent tornado that kills people and destroys neighborhoods in the normal historical record. The second scenario, tornado over you, staying over you, wind not diminishing because the storm is not moving away, describes something that had not been specifically documented in the modern American tornado record before 3:40 p.m. on May 27, 1997, 3 minutes, at wind speeds exceeding 260 miles per hour, in a circulation that is not moving away quickly. When the National Weather Service Damage Survey team arrives at Double Creek Estates in the days following May 27, 1997, they note something that has no precedent in the survey record. Not the foundations where houses used to be. Foundations are a common feature of F5 damage surveys. Not the absence of large debris. Large debris is reduced in any F5 event. What they note is something more fundamental. The ground itself is gone. In some locations, the soil that existed in Double Creek Estates before the tornado arrived has been removed to a depth of 18 inches. The Williamson County Blackland Prairie, one of the most productively farmed soil types in Texas, has been lifted from the earth. Not disturbed, not overturned. Physically removed and relocated by a tornado that remained over a single spot for 3 minutes and applied wind speeds that the original Fujita scale rates at a floor of 261 miles per hour. The asphalt that paved the subdivision's roads is also gone. Stripped from the roadbed, carried away, and reduced to the same category of debris as everything else that was in Double Creek Estates, small. The National Weather Service survey team writes in its formal report on the event that one of the most striking signs in approaching this area was the distinct lack of debris of any size. Closer inspection confirms the observation. There is debris present, but it is all very small. Nothing of identifiable size remains where the homes were. The team has worked F4 and F5 damage surveys before. It has not seen anything quite like this. The 40 homes that stood in Double Creek Estates on the morning of May 27, 1997, have been reduced, every one of them, to their concrete slab foundations and a field of fragments so small and so uniformly distributed that the surveyors who walk the site afterward are not looking at wreckage. They are looking at what remains after a building has been pulverized, not destroyed. Pulverized, the word distinction matters. A destroyed building leaves identifiable large pieces, roof sections, wall panels, furniture, appliances recognizable as their original objects. A pulverized building leaves fragments, many of them small enough to pick up in one hand, distributed across an area far larger than the building's original footprint. Of the 131 people who lived in Double Creek Estates, 27 are dead. Their remains are found at 30 different locations across the landscape surrounding the subdivision. some of them more than half a mile from where they lived. Forensic identification of some of the victims will require dental records. The violence of the tornado had taken everything else. This is the story of the Jarrell, Texas tornado of May 27, 1997. It is the story of an event that sits at the absolute outer boundary of what documented tornado science has ever measured. In wind speed, in forward motion, in dwell time, in ground destruction, and in forensic consequence. And it is the story of a storm that meteorologists, decades later, still describe as one of the most unusual atmospheric events in the modern record. A tornado that moved the wrong direction, at the wrong speed, for reasons that violated the standard assumptions that tornado science uses to predict, warn, and respond. If this kind of deep, real science holds your attention, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps. The ground is gone. Let's begin. Double Creek Estates in 1997 is a small, relatively new residential subdivision on the northwestern edge of the town of Jarrell, Texas, which itself sits in Williamson County, approximately 40 miles north of Austin, along Interstate 35. Jarrell in 1997 has a population of roughly 1,300 people. It is the kind of central Texas small town that exists in the agricultural corridor between the growth centers of the Austin metropolitan area to the south and the cities of the I-35 corridor to the north, Killeen, Temple, Waco to the northeast. Jarrell is unremarkable from the outside. A grain elevator visible from the highway, a few businesses along a main street, the scattered residential development that characterizes communities that exist at the edge of metropolitan expansion without quite being absorbed into it. In 1997, Austin's growth had not yet reached Jarrell in the way it would in subsequent decades. The town was itself. The homes in Double Creek Estates are standard wood frame residential construction. 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom family homes built in the early 1990s as the subdivision opened, on concrete slab foundations poured on the Williamson County Blackland Prairie. The Blackland Prairie is one of the most distinctive agricultural soils in Texas, a dark clay-rich topsoil that formed over millennia under native grassland, deep and productive when irrigated and managed, but also subject to dramatic shrink-swell cycles that create specific engineering challenges for construction. The clay expands when wet, contracts when dry, and over time exerts forces on concrete foundations and basement walls that make below-grade construction expensive and structurally demanding. In 1997, as in most of rural and small-town central Texas, virtually all residential construction in Jarrell is slab on grade. There are no basements. The underground dimension of residential construction, the dimension that, in the tornado-prone regions of the Great Plains, where basement construction is more common, provides the below-grade refuge that survives even F5 passage, does not exist in Double Creek Estates. The 131 people who live in Double Creek Estates on the morning of May 27, 1997, are living in 40 homes that sit atop concrete slabs on one of the most fertile and specifically cultivated soils in Texas. They have no underground option when the tornado warning sounds. Their houses are what they have. The morning of May 27 does not announce itself as a day that will produce one of the most violent tornadoes in American recorded history. The National Weather Service offices responsible for the Central Texas region are aware of a convective setup, conditions that could support severe thunderstorms, but the specific configuration of the atmosphere on this day is. In the words of meteorologists who have studied it intensively in retrospect, unusual in ways that are more apparent in the hindcast than in the real-time forecast. The setup lacks two of the four crucial ingredients that operational meteorologists use to identify high-risk severe weather days: strong upper-level forcing for atmospheric ascent, and significant wind shear across the lower troposphere. What the atmosphere on May 27, 1997 has in abundance that the standard ingredients framework does not fully capture as convective available potential energy: CAPE. CAPE is the numerical measure of how much energy is available in the atmosphere for the development of convective storms. Think of the atmosphere on a normal day as a column of air in approximate thermal equilibrium. If you push a parcel of air upward, it quickly becomes cooler and denser than the surrounding air and sinks back down. Stability. Think of a high CAPE atmosphere as a column of air where the opposite is true, where a rising air parcel remains warmer and lighter than the surrounding air for a great vertical distance, creating a positive feedback that accelerates the parcel upward with increasing force the higher it rises. The rising parcel carries heat, moisture, and momentum upward at rates that the energy difference between it and the surrounding air determines. On May 27, 1997, the CAPE values over central Texas are among the highest recorded in the observational record for that date and location. The atmosphere is under pressure, loaded with energy, waiting for the trigger that will release it. That trigger is a cold front moving southward through northern Texas, an unusual direction for frontal movement, which more commonly approaches from the west or northwest in the standard synoptic patterns of spring severe weather in this region. The southward-moving cold front intersects with warm, moist Gulf air streaming northward into central Texas. The dew point readings across Williamson County on May 27, the measure of atmospheric moisture content, are high even for May in the southern Texas climate. Warm dew points mean abundant water vapor available to fuel the convective updrafts that storms develop. The combination of extreme CAPE and high moisture content creates an atmosphere that, when convection is triggered, produces thunderstorm updrafts of extraordinary violence. The specific combination of high CAPE with low wind shear is what makes the Jarrell setup so unusual and, in retrospect, so poorly forecast in advance. In standard severe weather meteorology, wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with altitude, plays two roles. It organizes thunderstorms into supercell mode, enabling the persistent rotating updrafts that generate tornadoes, and it steers the resulting storms across the landscape at the speed and direction of the upper-level flow. Low shear means that neither of these standard effects operates normally. Tornadoes should be less likely because the rotating updraft that produces them is generated by the interaction of the storm's updraft with the environmental shear. And the storms that do develop should move slowly because the steering level wind that propels most storms is weak. A University of Wisconsin atmospheric science study of the Jarrell event concludes that the specific interaction of the southward cold front with the moisture-laden Gulf air in the context of extreme CAPE produced supercell thunderstorms through a mechanism that differs from the standard supercell formation pathway. The standard supercell is organized by wind shear. The Jarrell storm may have been organized by the interaction between the frontal boundaries and the convective available energy, an unconventional pathway to the same devastating outcome. A meteorologist at the NW's Austin, San Antonio office who was on duty that day described the outbreak as unexpected, and the lack of conventional severe weather indicators in the pre-storm analysis contributed to a situation where the warning timeline, though not absent, was compressed relative to what a more conventionally configured severe weather day would have provided. The southward moving cold front also produced the back-building storm complex, a series of supercells that did not race away to the northeast as most Texas severe weather does, but developed along the frontal boundary and then moved southwestward with it. The resulting storms tracked roughly parallel to Interstate 35 from northeast to southwest and produced multiple tornadoes as they moved. The Jarrell tornado was one of these, the most violent, the slowest, the most destructive, but part of a larger system that also spawned F3 and F4 tornadoes and produced severe weather across a broad swath of central Texas. Southwestward moving supercells in the United States are extremely rare. The dominant upper-level flow, the steering current that moves most weather systems across the country, moves from west to east across the continental United States. Tornadoes produced by supercells in this flow almost universally track toward the northeast, east, or southeast. The occasional left-moving supercell exists in the meteorological literature and is documented in the historical record. But violent F5 tornadoes tracking toward the southwest are essentially absent from the experience base of operational tornado forecasting in the modern era. The warnings, the positioning logic, the escape route assumptions. The safe side of the storm positioning that storm chasers and emergency managers use are all built around the assumption that a tornado in central Texas is moving northeast. The Jarrell tornado moves southwest. This directional reversal has practical consequences that extend beyond the cognitive challenge for residents trying to interpret the warning. Storm chasers who had positioned themselves for a northeast moving storm were on the wrong side. Emergency managers whose evacuation routing assumed a northeast track were planning for the wrong direction. The standard advice to get out of the tornado's path by moving at right angles to its track, advice that presumes you know which direction the track is running, defaults. In virtually all of the tornado preparedness materials of the era, to a calculation based on a northeastward track. The Jarrell tornado's southwestward movement meant that a resident who followed the standard advice and drove east or southeast was driving across or parallel to the tornado's track, rather than away from it. Meteorologist Lon Curtis, who performed post-event analysis of the event, documented that southward back-building supercells had appeared in the central Texas historical record before. This type of motion was not without precedent in the very long observational record of Texas severe weather. But it was rare enough that operational forecasters did not have it as a standard scenario in their severe weather pattern recognition library. The outcome was a tornado that moved in the direction that killed the most people, because the community it struck had no warning in the spatial sense, no expectation that danger would arrive from the north. The second directional anomaly is forward speed. When the Jarrell tornado reaches the northwest side of Jarrell and enters Double Creek Estates, it is moving at between 5 and 10 miles per hour. For comparison, a person walking at a moderate pace covers approximately 3 miles per hour. A brisk walk is 4. 5 to 10 miles per hour is the pace of someone who has somewhere to be but is not rushing. This is the forward speed of an F5 tornado. In tornado dynamics, forward speed matters for a specific and devastating reason. It determines how long any given point on the ground beneath the tornado remains inside the circulation. A tornado moving at 40 miles per hour passes over a fixed point in a few seconds. The most violent winds are present briefly. Then the storm has moved on. A tornado moving at 5 to 10 miles per hour passes over the same fixed point in a period measured in minutes. The structures in Double Creek Estates experience the full force of the Jarrell tornado's circulation, not for seconds, but for approximately 3 minutes, the time it takes the slow-moving storm to translate the width of its most violent core across the subdivision. 3 minutes of F5 wind speeds applied to a wood frame residential structure do not leave a damaged structure. They leave what the W's survey found in Double Creek Estates. Nothing. The physics of what happens to a structure during 3 minutes of winds exceeding 261 miles per hour requires a momentary departure from human scale. Wind force scales with the square of wind speed. Double the wind speed, quadruple the force. At 70 miles per hour, the force on the surface of a wall is significant and can damage lightly constructed buildings. At 130 miles per hour, the force is 4 times higher, Hurricane Category 4 territory, capable of destroying poorly constructed structures and damaging well-built ones. At 261 miles per hour, which is the minimum F5 threshold, the wind force on any surface is 14 times higher than at hurricane wind speed. The pressure difference between the front and back faces of a wall in winds of 261 miles per hour is not a force that wood frame construction was designed to resist, because no ordinary building was designed to resist it. The building code does not have a provision for 261 miles per hour, because 261 miles per hour is not a wind speed that building codes are written to address. The National Weather Service assessment of the Jarrell tornado notes that the SPC, Storm Prediction Center, describes the damage in terse terms that carry more weight precisely because of their understatement. This tornado blew some houses completely off the foundations and swept away the disintegrated remains. The word disintegrated is doing significant work in that sentence. It describes not the removal of a structure, which a powerful enough wind can accomplish at lower speeds, but the simultaneous removal and fragmentation of a structure into pieces so small that the survey team finds no identifiable large items in the path. The houses did not blow away intact. They disintegrated as they blew away. Now consider that this process occurred over 3 minutes rather than the few seconds typical of a fast-moving tornado's passage. And consider what it means for the soil beneath the structures. A standard house, blown off its foundation by a tornado, takes the contents of the house with it. The insulation, the drywall, the furniture, the carpet. All of it goes with the structure or becomes debris distributed across the surrounding landscape. But the foundation remains. The concrete slab, properly attached to footings embedded in the soil, is anchored. A tornado cannot lift a properly constructed slab foundation under normal F4 or even F5 conditions. The mass and the anchorage are too great. But a tornado sitting over a specific location for 3 minutes, with winds exceeding 261 miles per hour, can do something that no tornado damage survey in modern American history had documented before Jarrell. It can remove the soil from around and beneath the foundation in sufficient quantity that the survey team notes it explicitly. The Jarrell tornado, which has already removed the structure, the contents, the vehicles, the trees, and the asphalt from the road's surface, then applies its sustained violence to the ground itself. What lies beneath the structure? The Williamson County Blackland Prairie soil. Deep clay rich blackland that formed over thousands of years, is removed by the tornado's circulation to a depth of 18 inches in the areas where the tornado's core dwells longest over a single spot. 18 inches of soil removed. To understand what this means physically, the top 18 inches of the Blackland Prairie, is what agricultural scientists call the A horizon, the layer of organic, rich topsoil that supports plant growth, and that took thousands of years of prairie grass decomposition, rainfall, and biological activity to build. It is the layer that makes the Blackland Prairie some of the most fertile agricultural land in Texas. It is also, as Jarrell demonstrated, the layer that an F5 tornado at walking speed can strip away entirely, leaving the paler, less productive subsoil exposed below. The 18 inches of soil removed in some sections of Double Creek Estates did not evaporate. It was physically lifted by the tornado's circulation and transported elsewhere. Some of it, carried high in the storm's updraft, likely dispersed over a wide area as the storm dissipated. The Williamson County Blackland Prairie that had formed before the first European settler arrived in Texas, cultivated by the farmers and communities that the subdivision was built atop, left Double Creek Estates on May 27, 1997, in the company of the houses and the cars and the cattle and the lives of 27 people who had not anticipated this specific outcome. This is what the title means when it says the tornado destroyed the ground. Not metaphorically, literally, not the structures on the ground itself. Documented by the National Weather Service survey team. Entered into the official record, standing as the specific marker at the outer boundary of what documented American tornado violence has produced. The cattle count in the pasture adjacent to Double Creek Estates stands at approximately 300 head before the tornado arrives. Afterward, nearly all of them are dead. Many of them are found more than a quarter mile from the pasture, in conditions that the news assessment describes in terms typically reserved for objects rather than animals. They had been dismembered by the tornado's wind and carried parts of bodies, into the surrounding landscape. The degree of violence required to produce this outcome in large animals weighing hundreds of pounds each is not a number that a wind speed estimate can fully convey. At least half a dozen vehicles, cars, and trucks that had been parked in the driveways and on the roads of Double Creek Estates are found from the air in the open areas surrounding the subdivision. They are not simply overturned or displaced. The news assessment describes them as flattened and encrusted with mud and grass. They have been rolled and thrown and subjected to forces that have compressed and deformed them into shapes that make them difficult to recognize as vehicles from a distance. Some are found more than half a mile from where they were parked. One trunk lid is recovered 35 miles away. There was an iron bridge near the path of the tornado. The bridge, a structure weighing hundreds of tons and designed to carry the weight of vehicles across a waterway. A structure that does not move under any ordinary circumstances that a structure of its mass and anchorage would encounter, was torn from its support beams and shredded by the tornado's force into pieces that survivors later described as useless scraps. The bridge did not blow off intact, it was dismembered. The implication for what the same winds did to wood frame residential structures that weigh a fraction of what the bridge weighed requires no elaboration. Headstones at a cemetery in the tornado's path were pulled from the ground. Headstones that are set in the earth specifically to resist being moved, that are made of granite or marble and weigh hundreds of pounds, that are anchored to below-grade foundations precisely because the expectation is that they will remain in place for generations, and thrown nearly a quarter mile from their positions. The cemetery grounds that contained them were scoured in the same manner as the residential lots of Double Creek Estates. Some of the headstones were found intact, some were not. The tornado stripped bark from trees in its path, not just the outer bark layers, but the bark stripped cleanly to the wood beneath. by the combination of abrasive debris carried in the wind at high velocity and the mechanical force of the wind itself. Trees that survived the storm structurally, that were not uprooted or broken, bore the specific evidence of extreme wind speed in the form of their bare trunks. Bark is not designed to resist this. Nothing in the living world is designed to resist this. The cattle count in the pasture adjacent to Double Creek Estates stands at approximately 300 head before the tornado arrives. Afterward, nearly all of them are dead. Many of them are found more than a quarter mile from the pasture, in conditions that the Nubbs assessment describes in terms typically reserved for objects rather than animals. They had been dismembered by the tornado's wind and carried, parts of bodies, into the surrounding landscape. The degree of violence required to produce this outcome in large bovine animals weighing 1,000 to 1,500 pounds each, animals large and dense enough that ordinary severe weather cannot move them at all, is not a number that a wind speed estimate can fully convey. At 261 miles per hour, the aerodynamic force on an object scales with the square of the wind speed relative to the object's mass and cross-sectional area. Large cattle, which have a large cross-section and a large mass, require extreme forces to displace. The Jarrell tornado displaced them, dismembered them, threw them a quarter mile. At least half a dozen vehicles, cars and trucks that had been parked in the driveways and on the roads of Double Creek Estates are found from the air in the open areas surrounding the subdivision. They are not simply overturned or displaced. The news assessment describes them as flattened and encrusted with mud and grass. They have been rolled and thrown and subjected to forces that have compressed and deformed them into shapes that make them difficult to recognize as vehicles from a distance, as if they had been placed beneath a press and then thrown across a field. Some are found more than half a mile from where they were parked. One trunk lid is recovered 35 miles away. Testimony to the height to which at least some of the subdivision's debris was carried aloft before the storm's updraft dispersed it across the Texas landscape. The forensic consequences of this level of destruction were, in 1997, without precedent in American tornado history. The 27 people who died in Double Creek Estates were not found intact at the site of their homes. Their remains were scattered across 30 different locations across the landscape surrounding the subdivision, some of them more than half a mile from the address where they lived. The tornado's circulation had carried human remains along with everything else from Double Creek Estates and distributed them across a wide area in various states of fragmentation. The subsequent hours of Texas May heat accelerated the deterioration of remains that were already exposed to the elements across an open landscape. Forensic identification of the victims required dental records for those whose remains had been damaged beyond visual recognition by the violence of the tornado. This is not a characterization that applies to every tornado death. In most tornado fatalities, identification is straightforward and relies on normal visual identification or standard documentary procedures. In Jarrell, the specific combination of F5 wind speeds, 3-minute dwell time, and the mechanical violence of the storm's circulation produced forensic conditions that required the full resources of the identification system available in 1997. The dental records confirmed what the debris field had already demonstrated, that the tornado had processed everything inside Double Creek Estates with a thoroughness that left almost nothing intact. Among the 27 who died were entire families, parents and children who had been at home on a Tuesday afternoon. Among the survivors were residents who had left for work or errands in the hours before the storm arrived, who returned to find the slab where their home had been, and learned from the debris field the scale of what had occurred. The binary nature of the survival outcome at Jarrell, in or out, alive or dead, no meaningful middle ground, meant that some families lost everyone who had been home, and others lost no one, purely as a function of whether a particular family member had needed to go somewhere that afternoon. Weather Underground's retrospective on the Jarrell tornado stated the outcome with directness that the data supports, other than one serious injury. Everyone affected by this tornado either came away relatively unscathed from an encounter with its outer edge, or was killed in its destructive core. No survivor account exists from within the most destructive section of Double Creek Estates that day, because no one in the most destructive section survived to give one. This is not a statement about heroism or preparation or decision-making. It is a statement about physics. The wind force applied for the duration applied to structures of the construction type present produced an outcome that did not leave a middle category. The specific absence of survivors from the core is what distinguishes Jarrell from most tornado death tolls, where some fraction of people sheltering in interior rooms do survive even violent F5 events. In those events, the tornado moves fast enough that the structure's failure and the tornado's passage are approximately simultaneous. The wind reaches peak force, the structure fails, and the tornado has moved on before the surviving debris is fully dispersed. In Jarrell, the 3-minute dwell time meant the structure failed, the debris dispersed, and the tornado continued to apply its force to everything remaining, including the soil, the pavement, and the occupants, for an extended period. The interior room provides protection only as long as the structure around it remains intact. In the Jarrell core, no structure remained intact long enough for that protection to matter. The warning that the Nebulas had issued, a formal tornado warning, broadcast through all standard emergency communication channels at 3:30 p.m. CDT, reached the residents of Jarrell with 10 minutes before the tornado's peak intensity. What those 10 minutes required of the people who received the warning was, in the absence of basements, a decision to leave the structure entirely and seek a more substantially built refuge. The conventional tornado shelter guidance of the era advised moving to an interior room, a bathroom, a closet, away from windows. This guidance is appropriate for the range of tornadoes that most people will ever encounter, F1 through F3 events, in which interior rooms provide meaningful protection by removing a person from windows and flying glass, and by placing structural mass between them and the wind. It is not appropriate as a survival strategy in the core of an F5 at walking speed. In the most violent section of Double Creek Estates, there was no combination of shelter choices available within the residential structures that would have provided survival-level protection. The 3 minutes the tornado spent over the subdivision did not allow time for any feature of wood frame residential construction to provide the resistance that would distinguish severely damaged but survivable from pulverized. The only survival strategy that the physics of the Jarrell tornado permitted was to not be inside the core of its circulation when it was over Double Creek Estates. Those who were not there survived. Those who were there did not. This is the brutal arithmetic of the tornado that moved at walking speed. What the atmospheric science can now explain about why the Jarrell tornado behaved as it did is more complete than what was understood on May 27, 1997. and the explanation illuminates why the event continues to be studied by tornado scientists more than 2 decades later. The southwestward movement of the storm was produced by the specific configuration of the atmospheric flow on that day. The cold front approaching from the north, the Gulf moisture streaming in from the southeast, the unusual combination of high instability with low wind shear at the synoptic scale. This combination, which lacks the typical ingredients for severe weather outbreak, still managed to produce violent tornadoes because of the extraordinary CAPE, the energy available in the atmospheric column. That overcame the absence of the organizing mechanisms that usually produce tornado outbreaks. The supercell that generated the Jarrell tornado developed and moved in the direction the atmospheric flow allowed it to move, which was southwestward, and the tornado it produced moved in the same direction. The slow forward speed of the tornado over Double Creek Estates is a related product of the specific atmospheric dynamics of that storm. In most supercells, the storm is propelled forward by the upper-level jet stream or other synoptic scale flow patterns that give the system its characteristic track and speed. The Jarrell storm had no strong upper-level flow driving it. The upper-level winds were weak, one of the 2 absent ingredients in the standard severe weather checklist. The storm moved slowly because the atmosphere was not pushing it quickly. The result was a tornado that covered less ground per minute than any comparable F5 in the modern record, and therefore spent more time per unit of ground than any comparable F5 in the modern record. Here is the specific and uncomfortable conclusion that this combination of factors produces. The meteorological features that made the Jarrell tornado less likely to exist by conventional forecasting criteria were simultaneously the features that made it more destructive once it did exist. Low wind shear reduces the probability of tornado formation. Low wind shear also reduces the speed at which the storm system moves. A storm with low forward speed dwells longer over each parcel of ground. A tornado that dwells longer over a fixed point applies its wind force for a longer duration. Wind force times duration determines structural damage and ground scouring. The tornado that should not have existed by conventional meteorological reasoning caused the most extreme ground-level destruction in the modern documented record precisely because the conditions that made it unlikely also made it slow. The event changed several things in the NUS's approach to Central Texas severe weather forecasting and warning communication. The ability to identify southwestward moving supercells and issue timely warnings for communities to the south-southwest, the downtrack direction that would not normally require priority warning relative to conventional northeast tracking storms, was incorporated into training and operational protocols at the Austin-San Antonio NW's office. Meteorologist Kevin Ritter, who was working at the NW's during the 1997 outbreak, described it as definitely a life-changing event, but also a career-defining event. The outbreak was unexpected in the pre-event assessment, and that unexpectedness was itself a lesson. The standard severe weather indicators that operational meteorologists rely on as shortcuts for probability assessment had failed to flag the Jarrell setup as a high-end event in advance. The absence of the usual indicators should not be read as the absence of danger. The warning timeline for the Jarrell tornado, 10 minutes between the formal warning and the tornado's arrival at Double Creek Estates, also prompted study of whether additional lead time was achievable with better tools. In 1997, the Wesser 88D NEXRAD Doppler radar network had been operational for only a few years, replacing the older non-Doppler radar systems that had preceded it. The NEXRAD network provided, for the first time in standard operational meteorology, real-time velocity data that allowed detection of rotational signatures in developing supercells before tornadoes touched down. No mobile Doppler radar was deployed on the Jarrell storm. The mobile radar programs that would later provide high-resolution close-range data were in their infancy in 1997. The best available data came from the fixed NEXRAD network, at distances that limited the spatial resolution of the rotational signature in the storm's early development. Since Jarrell, the NUS's median tornado warning lead time has increased substantially. The average lead time before a tornado touches down, the interval between the issuance of a tornado warning and the tornado's ground contact, improved from roughly 5 minutes in the pre-NEXRAD era to approximately 13 minutes by the 2010s. Part of this improvement came from better use of the velocity data that NEXRAD provides. Part of it came from the dual polarization upgrade that the NEXRAD network received between 2011 and 2013, which provides additional meteorological information beyond what single polarization radar offers. And part of it came from the study of events like Jarrell, which documented the specific cost of insufficient lead time and motivated the investment in the research and operational improvements that have closed the gap. The specific threat of the slow-moving supercell in a high-cape, low-shear environment was incorporated into training materials and operational guidance for NW's offices across the southern United States after 1997. The recognition that slow supercell motion represents a specific compounded hazard beyond what the wind speed alone implies is now part of the operational assessment framework that meteorologists apply when evaluating any developing supercell. A tornado warning for a fast-moving F2 storm and a tornado warning for a slow-moving F5 storm carry different risk profiles that the warning text in the standard format does not fully distinguish. The post-Jarrell evolution of impact-based warning language, which attempts to communicate the expected consequences rather than merely the meteorological parameters, is partly traceable to the recognition that Jarrell's warning, which was technically accurate in its description of a tornado emergency, did not fully convey to residents without basements what the appropriate protective action actually was. The global significance of the Jarrell tornado sits at the intersection of two specific scientific questions that tornado research has been working on since 1997. The first question is, what is the absolute maximum destruction that a tornado can produce? And what are the physical limits of that maximum? The Jarrell tornado sets a specific data point near the extreme end of the documented damage envelope. The 18 inches of soil removal, the pulverization of all 40 structures to the point that no large debris remained, the dispersal of human remains to 30 locations over a half-mile radius. These are not simply the worst case of standard F5 damage. They are a qualitatively different category of destruction that has been documented in no other tornado event with comparable completeness. The closest comparison in the scientific literature is to tornadoes that have scoured soil in specific locations. Soil scouring is documented in other F5 events, including the 1955 Blackwell, Oklahoma tornado and the 1947 Woodward, Oklahoma tornado. But Jarrell's combination of dwell time, wind speed, and path position over a dense residential area produced a cumulative destruction that researchers still point to as the benchmark for tornado violence at the extremes. The original Fujita scale, which the endos used to rate the Jarrell tornado, has an F5 category that corresponds to estimated peak gusts of 261 to 318 miles per hour. The lower bound, 261/5, is what the NOAA/NWs assigns to the Jarrell tornado based on the damage survey. The upper bound, 318/5, represents the most extreme winds ever directly documented in a tornado anywhere in the world, measured by the Doppler on Wheels mobile radar in the 1999 Bridge Creek Moor, Oklahoma tornado. The Jarrell tornado, with no mobile radar in the field and no direct velocity measurement of its core winds, carries the floor rating for its category. But the damage it produced, the soil removal depth, the iron bridge shredded, the headstones thrown, the complete absence of identifiable large debris, has led some researchers to suggest that the actual winds in the Jarrell core may have been toward the upper end of the F5 range, rather than the lower. There is no way to confirm this. The damage evidence is the only available record. When the enhanced Fujita scale replaced the original Fujita scale for U.S. tornado rating in 2007, one of the motivations was the recognition that the original scale's damage indicator descriptions were not calibrated with sufficient engineering precision to produce consistent ratings across different survey teams. The F scale introduced specific damage indicators, numbered structural and natural object types, and specific degrees of damage descriptions for each, with engineering-derived wind speed estimates. The EF5 category in the new scale corresponds to estimated peak gusts exceeding 200 mph, lower than the Fujita scale's F5 floor of 261 mph, reflecting the consensus among engineers that wind speeds in the F5 range had historically been overestimated, and that damage documented as F5 was producible at somewhat lower speeds than originally assumed. The Jarrell tornado, if it were rated today under the F scale, would certainly receive an EF5 rating. The ground scouring and the complete structural removal documented in the NW's survey fall clearly within EF5 indicators. Whether its actual peak winds exceeded 200 mph or 261 mph or approached 300 mph remains unknown. The second question is, what does it mean for emergency management when a tornado can apply F5 winds to the same location for 3 minutes rather than 3 seconds? This question is not abstract. It has practical implications for the design of community tornado shelters, for the guidance given to residents in areas without basements, and for the threshold at which warning agencies should consider recommending actions beyond the standard interior room guidance. The conventional residential shelter guidance is appropriate for the tornadoes that most people will encounter, F1 through F3 events, which represent the overwhelming majority of all tornadoes, and provides meaningful protection in even F4 conditions if the shelter location is well chosen. The Jarrell tornado represents the specific scenario at the extreme that the conventional guidance cannot address, an F5 tornado moving at walking speed, applying wind forces 14 times greater than Hurricane Category 4 for 3 minutes, to structures not engineered for any fraction of that wind speed. There is no interior room option in a wood frame residential structure that survives this scenario. The only options that survive it are engineered below-grade storm shelters, specifically designed, specifically built, specifically tested against the loads that F5 conditions impose, and engineered above-grade safe rooms built to FEMA specifications. Jarrell is one of the specific events that drove the expanded investment in community and residential tornado shelters in Texas in the years and decades following 1997. The Texas Division of Emergency Management expanded its community shelter construction program after 1997. FEMA's Safe Room Design Guidelines, which had been published in limited form before 1997, received more prominent promotion and more active federal investment in the post-Jarrell period. The connection between Jarrell and the shelter investment that followed is not always explicit in the policy documents. Other events contributed, including the 1999 Oklahoma City tornado. but the specific case Jarrell makes for below-grade or engineered above-grade shelter in the most tornado-exposed communities of central and southern Texas is the case that the damage survey evidence. The forensic record and the binary survival outcome of Double Creek Estates makes as completely as any single event can. Globally, the Jarrell tornado is studied by meteorologists in countries that experience violent tornadoes: Canada, Bangladesh, Argentina, Brazil, parts of Europe, as the specific American example of what can happen when the combination of violent wind speed and slow forward motion creates a dwell time that standard sheltering assumptions cannot accommodate. In Bangladesh, where the highest per event tornado death tolls in the world are recorded, Bangladesh experiences some of the most violent tornadoes on Earth in terms of fatality concentration, partly because of population density and partly because of the near-total absence of engineered shelter. The lessons of Jarrell have been incorporated into the academic literature on tornado risk mitigation. Even though the specific atmospheric setup of the 1997 Central Texas event does not directly apply to the Bay of Bengal tornado environment, the principle applies everywhere. The combination of violent wind speed and slow forward motion is the specific compound that the Jarrell tornado documented, and the principle that slow tornadoes at extreme intensity are categorically more destructive than fast tornadoes at the same intensity is now a settled finding in the global tornado science literature. At 3:53 p.m. CDT on May 27, 1997, the tornado dissipates. Its total time on the ground is 13 minutes. Its total path length is approximately 5 miles. Its maximum width is 3/4 of a mile. These are the numbers that appear in the official record alongside the F5 rating and the $40 million damage estimate. They are accurate numbers, precisely measured by the survey teams and the radar records that document the event. The numbers that do not appear in the official record in the same way are the 3 minutes the tornado spent over Double Creek Estates, the 18 inches of soil it removed from the Williamson County Blackland Prairie, the 30 locations where human remains were recovered, the 35 miles from which one piece of wreckage was eventually retrieved. The NUMS damage survey that arrives in the days following the tornado uses language that the agency typically avoids in its operational vocabulary, language that describes what was found in the terms that the evidence requires, rather than in the hedged technical terminology that damage surveys usually employ. The earth was scoured bare, pavement was ripped from roadways. Homes and other buildings were completely pulverized, not damaged, not destroyed. Pulverized is the right word for what the Jarrell tornado did to Double Creek Estates. It is the right word because it captures the specific violence of an F5 operating at walking speed over a fixed location for 3 minutes, applying force 14 times greater than hurricane wind speed to structures that were not designed to resist it for 3 seconds. Pulverized is the word that distinguishes Jarrell from every other F5 in the American record, not because the wind speeds were necessarily higher, but because the duration of application was. The same wind that destroys a house in seconds, given 3 minutes, leaves the record that the NW's survey team found no large debris. The ground below the structure removed to a depth of 18 inches. The cars flattened and encrusted in mud half a mile away. The tornado was unusual in its direction. It was extreme in its intensity. It was disqualifying in its slow forward speed, disqualifying of every shelter option that the residents of Double Creek Estates had available to them that afternoon, because the slow forward speed extended the dwell time to a duration at which no wood frame residential structure could remain intact long enough to provide meaningful protection. The physics of the event did not permit survival inside a standard house in the core path. The physics permitted only the absence from the core path to be survival. 27 people were not absent. They were home on a Tuesday afternoon, which is where people who live in their homes tend to be on Tuesday afternoons, with no particular reason to expect that this Tuesday was the one that would require them to be somewhere else. The concrete slab foundations are still there, long after the subdivision was not rebuilt in the same location, long after the Texas prairie reasserted itself over the scoured ground. The foundations remain as documentation of where the homes stood and what stood on them. They are what the tornado chose to leave, not because the tornado made choices, but because the physics of concrete anchored to footings embedded 3 feet into the ground created a connection that even 3 minutes of F5 wind speeds could not entirely sever. The foundations, which the tornado's violence stripped of everything above them, mark the location the way a chalk outline marks a scene. Here was a house. Here was a family's material world. Here was someone's Tuesday afternoon. The Jarrell tornado entered the record books with the numbers that quantify its behavior. F5, 13 minutes, 5.1 miles, 1,075 miles wide, 27 dead, $40 million in damage. These numbers are accurate and they are telling. They do not fully capture what is captured in the phrase "the earth was scoured bare," in the specific, documented, surveyed. Confirmed depth of 18 inches that the National Weather Service measured as the removal of the Williamson County Blackland Prairie from the place where 40 homes and 131 people and an ordinary Tuesday afternoon had been. The ground around the foundations was 18 inches deeper before the storm arrived. That depth is the specific measure of what it looks like when a tornado does not just destroy what is above the ground. It takes the ground itself